Yeah, my little birthday girl. Yeah. 9 years old. She doesn't look the part though. Today she got a grilled chicken. A whole grilled chicken. She have eaten the wings and the legs. So far. We have beef sticks and we have a lot of things, Amma. It's cloudy. Not the best of weathers. Well, she decides. I think she's following tracks or something. Nine years old, Amma. Gosh. And you still look like a puppy. I'm not sure we should go that way, Amma. Do you want to? Or are you just following tracks? Because that would make this very much shorter. Yeah. She didn't want to go there. At 3 o'clock, she told me that she wanted to go out. You deserve getting out today. Even though it's only local forest. If it would have been a weekend, Amma, we would have gone out somewhere. Actually, no matter the weather, we would have gone out. But that will be this weekend. Looking at places to go. Now you are trotting on. Almost thinking she has something in front of her. So we know where to go in the summer. Not telling you. And then we're also going on a trip 1st of May. Like we did last year. Where are we going to go this winter, Amma? Are we going further north? It would be fun to be up in Jämtland, Härjedalen, during Christmas, but it's a little too far away. But there are lots of places we can go. You're becoming old, Amma. Yeah. Yeah, you want a treat? Oh, really? Are we? Okay. Good, she wasn't too opposed. I mean, she could have been. Someone has pooped in the middle of the trail or path. That's Yama? No, it's not. It could have been. Because you're pooping in the middle of the path. I know. The old football field. Only the traffic that kind of destroys the scene. The bird song, lovely pine forest. There's been a doggo there. Little sweetie. Yeah. It was a small one. Yeah, it was a small one. But you are getting way nicer when we get home. I'm trying to not feed you too much with other things today, because you have massive amount of chicken. And other things. Having her birthday is two-sided. Because I start to think about the future. How to balance things. But it's not the first time. Uh-oh. Hiding behind the tree. Placed herself perfectly. Hello. Yeah. Hello. Okay. You got a road here on your birthday, Emma. That's funny. Oh, maybe it looped around. Could be. Okay, what are we looking at? Oh, did it stop there? Okay. I like this horse though. I'm blessed with having this nice forest right next to where we live. You found a stick, Emma. Was it not a good stick? Okay. I was waiting for you to pick one up. Now last year was sticks and more sticks, even more sticks. This year, not so much. I think she was a bit surprised that we went for the full local forest today. Yeah, we had time. Well, they've stopped putting crap into it. And they threw it in here for some very strange reason. Don't know why. And Daddy has only had a sandwich today. What was that? More. Where are we going? We're going. Okay. Okay. We can go this way. We turn up by the peak there now, huh? This one part is growing. It was more open before. Yeah, people have been burning stuff, yeah. Well, this is clearly higher than everything around. I've been a good girl today. Just wandering around, being happy. Okay. We went that way. Something's walked down. We had a very clear interest going that direction. So we took the big path today. We can do that. It feels like it's going to rain, but it doesn't really. Yeah, let's go down. Let's see if we meet any friends. I don't think so. Depends when we end up, huh? Budding leaves. And a lot of birds on in traffic. It's a very strange birthday walk, huh? Normally, I give you free reign to do pretty much what you want. So it's normally stick place and walking around in ponds. I did nothing of that. A really calm walk. Yeah, it was. It was a really calm walk. You want a treat? Yeah, you can have a treat.